Now, brave and friendly he might have been, but I've got to tell you, his master at the bakery thought that he was nothing better than a fool, for that was all he wanted to do, to make other people laugh and joke. And now this boy had long grey hair and a huge coat on his back, which didn't belong to him. In fact, they belonged to the master baker, and he placed the master baker's wig upon his head, and now he was dancing around and throwing his arms to make the other apprentice bakers laugh. Well, it might have been quite funny, but inside a bakery it is hot and the ovens can burn, and as he raised his arm up, he burnt the cuff of his master's coat that he could never have paid for in 100 lifetimes. But here he was, trying to make the other boys laugh, dancing around. Now, he wasn't really a fool, because he could read, not very well, not as if he'd ever been to school, but he could read cookery books well enough to make sure that he would make fine foods that would lay upon people's tongue. And this was the way, as he was dancing around, screaming and yelling, and the other boys were laughing as his bare feet clattered on the dusty and flower-covered ground, the master returned. He didn't scream. He didn't yell. He didn't bawl or howl or holler. He just stood there and watched his best coat being burned on the side of the oven. He watched his wig being filled with flour. And it was as the boys started to imitate the baker's voice that finally the baker snapped. "You, sir, are nothing more than a fool. Come here!" But the boy was quick. He was strong enough. He was strong even on his bare feet on the slippery, floured ground. But he ran, and the baker, he looked and thought, there is no way that I will catch that fool of a boy by running after him. And here he reached towards a book, a scary-looking, leather-bound book with faded pages, in amongst all of his cookery books. That baker took the book and he flung it through the air, and it was almost as if the way that the pages went, that it started to fly through the air. And the boy was expecting it to strike him on the back of his head, when it was there and fluttered in the air like a seagull or a crow or a parrot as it landed upon his shoulder. He laughed to himself. He knew that he'd better take off his master's coat and his master's wig. But he looked through the pages, and even he could not understand what these strange writings were, for they didn't seem to make much sense to him. But the idea of sitting down and reading one of his master's books, especially now outside in the good cold air. So he sat, and he pulled up an old piece of cloth, an old piece of sacking that the flour and the grain had come into the bakery, and he sat upon it, and he started to read. Now, without understanding what the words meant, he was speaking them out loud. And it was then that he found himself, just like the book, raising himself up into the air and swooping this way and that. He was frightened, more frightened than he had ever been in all of his life. But the thrill was there, and the pages in the book flapped about, and he looked around, and it was as he looked down he could see the chimneys in all of London town. He could look and he could see that there was a fire over here, and there was another chimney with its smoke pluming out and up into the air, and he looked and he saw that there was a house on fire over there by the side of the house on fire by the side of the river. He swooped down and saw that it was coming closer and closer towards his master's house. Now he knew that his master would not be very pleased to see him returned after having spoiled his coat and dusted up his wig. But he was there, and he banged on the door. "Please let me in, let me in. These sorcerer's words have let me see that there is a great fire and that it's coming closer." The other boys knew that there had been many fires inside of London. Some of them hadn't been born that long before, 1642, when there was a huge fire. And there was another fire in 1658, and another in 1661. And now it looked as if there was going to be a huge fire on this September's night in 1666. One by one, his friends, who were very brave indeed, decided that they would get on to the great wad of sake, and they would fly away and out of the country. He could only take them in ones and twos, and it was when that the master baker could smell the burning in the air that he too relented and said that he would like to have some help from this very good boy that he's always liked all through the time that he'd worked for him. And the two of them flew. The master's weight was almost too much for the sacking, even with magic woven within its threads. But he took them out to the countryside, where each and every one of all of those apprentices stood and wondered what it was they were going to do. But when there is a great fire and there is no bread to eat, then other food needs to be made and found and flour. And that was just what they did. Or they didn't have a bakery, but they could cook the bread by open fires and make sure that all of the people who had been dispossessed and displaced by the fire could find some food to eat. The master hadn't left the bakery empty-handed. He had also brought with him his favourite cookery books, which the boy read and used. And the master said, "You may have been foolish, but you are certainly the bravest of all of the apprentices that I have ever had. And I would wish you to have this." And here he handed over his favourite cookery book to the apprentice. He didn't cast the master out. He didn't send the other apprentices away. They worked as if they were of one family. And people would travel from the north and the south, from the east and from the west, to come and taste the finest bread that had ever been tasted in all of this life. And if people were to ask how they had travelled from the middle of town to the outskirts of London, he would smile to himself and say, "Oh, it was upon the wings of a book, a good book, a book that I still cannot read." But everyone thought that was just a foolish thing to say, as they would eat the best bread in all of England.